had always been a man of faith, devoted to my pastoral duties in the small village of Aber. The people trusted me, revered me even, for my words carried weight, and my sermons brought comfort. But it wasn't my preaching that caused the village to stir. It was the whispers, rumors so wild, I could hardly believe they spoke of me. The pastor's manhood is holy, they said, a gift from God that can heal barren women. At first, I brushed it off as superstition. After all, how could something so personal become the subject of divine intervention? But then, one evening, a woman named Ya came to my door. Her eyes were swollen from weeping. Her shoulders slumped under the weight of a sorrow I could not yet understand. She had been married for years without a child, and in our village that was more than a private pain. It was a curse. Her husband, the other women, even her own family had begun to distance themselves from her, branding her as the barren one. She came to me not for prayer, but for something more. "Pastor, they say you have been chosen by God," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Chosen to heal women like me." I hesitated, torn between disbelief and the growing pressure to act. What could I say? I had no power over such matters. But Ya's desperation clawed at my heart, and the rumors had already spread far beyond my control. I prayed with her, asking for divine intervention, and sent her on her way, hoping that the story would end there. But it didn't. That night, Ya dreamt of conception, and a month later, she was with child. The villagers proclaimed it a miracle, and so the legend of my holy manhood was born. After Ya's pregnancy, the once quiet streets of Aber began to swell with visitors. Women from neighboring villages, even towns, came in search of the same blessing. They gathered outside my church, their faces etched with longing, their hands clasped in prayer. The village elders, who had always been pillars of wisdom, turned a blind eye, saying it was God's will if I had been chosen. Even my wife, Akoshua, who knew me better than anyone, could not deny the apparent miracles unfolding before us. At first, I refused to entertain the idea. It was madness, pure and simple. But the pressure mounted, and with each passing day, the crowd grew more insistent. One woman even brought her entire family, hoping that if she bore a child, it would lift them all from poverty. "Pastor, please," she begged. "God has given you a gift. Don't deny His will." The lines between faith and fear blurred. How could I, a mere man, hold such power? And yet, the women who came to me were desperate, their lives shaped by the cruel judgments of a society that measured their worth by their fertility. Slowly, I began to wonder if perhaps this was God's plan for me after all. If He had chosen me for this purpose, who was I to question it? I convinced myself that I was only an instrument of His will. The first woman after Ya came to me late one evening, trembling as she stood in the doorway of my modest home. Her name was Ajoa, and her tears mirrored Ya's silent, filled with years of despair. I didn't know what to do, but I felt the weight of expectation on my shoulders. The village watched me, waiting for another miracle. I prayed with her, laid hands on her, and, God help me, did more than that. I told myself it was for the greater good, that I was bringing life where there had only been emptiness. But deep inside, a small voice whispered, warning me of the price I would one day pay. The weeks passed, and more women came to me, their bellies soon swelling with life. Word of the miracle pastor spread far beyond our village. I began to receive letters, gifts, even money, from strangers who had heard of my supposed gift. The church was filled to the brim each Sunday, but it was no longer my sermons that people came for. They came for my body, for the life they believed I could give them. The weight of it all bore down on me, heavier than any burden I had carried before. Akoshua, my wife, began to grow distant. She had supported me in the beginning, convinced that I was acting out of divine duty. But now she barely spoke to me. The air in our home grew thick with tension, an unspoken accusation lingering between us. She knew what I had done, and while she did not confront me, the silence spoke volumes. I could see the pain in her eyes, the doubt creeping in like a slow, suffocating fog. I had betrayed her trust, though I told myself it was for the good of the village, for the women who needed hope. But with each new woman who came to me, the gnawing guilt grew harder to ignore. I had become something I never intended to be. No longer a man of God, but a man driven by fear and fame, caught in a web of lies I could not untangle. It wasn't long before I began to feel the weight of my actions in more than just my heart. The village elders, who had once praised me, now looked at me with a mix of suspicion and awe. Their support had always been conditional, and as the rumors grew more wild and extravagant, so too did their unease. Some whispered that I was no longer a pastor, but a sorcerer, using dark powers to achieve these so-called miracles. Others saw me as a man blessed beyond measure, but unworthy of the gift I had been given. The church council summoned me one evening. The air was thick with tension as I entered the room, where 5 stern-faced men sat around a table. The head elder, Nana Kwaku, cleared his throat and fixed me with a hard stare. "Pastor, we have heard troubling things," he began, his voice low. "Your miracles, they've brought life to barren women, yes, but they've also brought questions. Some say you're not doing God's work but your own. What do you have to say for yourself?" I was trapped. How could I defend myself when even I wasn't sure where God's will ended and my own began? I mumbled something about faith, about being a vessel for divine intervention, but the words felt hollow even to my own ears. The elders listened, but I could see doubt flickering in their eyes. Nana Kwaku leaned forward. "We can't have scandal in this village, Pastor. If what you're doing is truly God's work, then so be it. But if it's something else..." He let the words hang in the air, unfinished but heavy with implication. I left the meeting with a sinking feeling in my gut. The very people who had once lifted me up were now preparing to tear me down. And deep within me, I knew they were right to question. What had started as a desperate attempt to help had spiraled into something darker, something I could no longer control. The turning point came when one of the women, Cece, claimed that her child was not a blessing but a curse. She had come to me in faith, seeking a miracle, but after her baby was born, things took a dark turn. The child was sickly, frail, and no matter what remedies the healers tried, it would not get better. Cece, once full of hope, now believed that her child was a punishment, a result of my unholy interference. She came to the church one Sunday, her voice rising above the hymns, accusing me in front of the entire congregation. "You said it was God's will?" she screamed, clutching her sickly child to her chest. "But this is no blessing. My baby is dying, and it's your fault." The congregation fell silent, all eyes turning to me. For the first time, the villagers saw me not as a miracle worker, but as something else, something dangerous. I tried to calm her, to offer prayers, but Cece's rage could not be soothed. She cursed me in front of the altar, and her words echoed in the silent church, sending a chill through the room. From that moment on, the miracles stopped. Women who came to me after Cece left without the blessing they had sought. It was as if God had withdrawn his favor, leaving me to face the consequences of my actions alone. The villagers began to murmur that I had lost my power, that I had angered God. And for the first time, I began to believe them. Cece's public outburst was just the beginning. In the weeks that followed, more women came forward, not with praise but with complaints. Some claimed their children were born with deformities. Others said they had miscarried shortly after their visits to me. The miracle that had once defined me was now a curse, and the villagers turned on me with a vengeance. The rumors spread like wildfire, reaching even the neighboring towns. It wasn't long before outsiders began visiting Aber, not to seek my services, but to witness the fall of the miracle pastor. I became a spectacle, a cautionary tale for those who dared to blur the lines between faith and temptation. Akojua could no longer look at me. Our once peaceful home had become a place of constant tension. She left for her mother's house, saying she needed space to think, but I knew it was more than that. I had broken something between us that could never be repaired. One evening, as I sat alone in the church, I found myself questioning everything. Had I ever truly been called by God, or had I been deceiving myself from the start? The voice of doubt that had once been a whisper was now a roaring presence in my mind. I was no longer sure of anything, least of all myself. And then, as if to confirm my worst fears, I received word from the church council. They were investigating me for heresy. The village that had once embraced me was now preparing to cast me out. The church council's investigation marked the beginning of my downfall. The elders, once hesitant to question me, now openly discussed the possibility of excommunication. They visited my home, my church, and even spoke to the women who had once praised my gift. The testimonies they gathered painted a grim picture. I had overstepped my bounds, tampered with God's will, and brought nothing but suffering disguised as miracles. Akoshua, who had left me in silent anguish, returned only to finalize her decision. She stood before me, her face a mask of sorrow and disappointment. "Kojo," she said, using my birth name instead of the title pastor, as if I had been stripped of my role in her eyes. "This is not the man I married. This is not the life we were meant to live." I tried to explain, to tell her that I had never intended for things to spiral out of control. But the truth hung between us like a weight too heavy to lift. I had betrayed her, not just as a husband but as a man of God. She left without another word, and I knew she would never return. In the days that followed, the church services became emptier. The pews that had once overflowed with faithful believers now stood mostly vacant, save for a few curious onlookers who came to witness the spectacle of my undoing. I had once been the village's guiding light, but now I was an outcast, a living reminder of what happens when power is misused. The council's final decision came swiftly. I was stripped of my pastoral duties, and the church doors were closed to me. The elders gathered the villagers to announce my excommunication, proclaiming that I had led the people astray. "This is a man who has lost his way," Nana Kwaku said gravely. "He has taken what was meant to be holy and turned it into something dark." As I stood before the congregation, listening to the words of my condemnation, I realized that this was the price I had to pay. I had believed in my own power more than in the will of God, and now I was facing the consequences of my hubris. With my position stripped away and the village turning its back on me, I found myself wandering the streets aimlessly. The people no longer met my gaze, and the whispers that followed me felt like daggers in my back. My once revered name had become synonymous with scandal. The women who had once come to me for blessings now avoided me, ashamed of the faith they had placed in me. In my isolation, doubt consumed me. The church had been my entire identity, my purpose. Now, without it, I felt adrift in a sea of uncertainty. Had I ever truly been a man of faith, or had I been blinded by the allure of power? The miracles I had once believed in now seemed like cruel illusions, and I could no longer tell where God's will had ended and my own desires had begun. I tried to find solace in prayer, but the silence that met me was unbearable. It was as if God had turned his back on me, leaving me to face the darkness alone. I spent sleepless nights searching for answers, but none came. All that remained was the gnawing guilt that I had led so many astray. One evening, as I sat by the riverbank, I was approached by Sisi, the very woman whose public accusation had triggered my downfall. She stood before me, holding her sickly child, her eyes filled not with anger but with something else. Pity. "I don't know if you're to blame for all of this, Pastor," she said quietly, "but I do know that we all wanted to believe in something, even if it wasn't real." Her words struck me deeply. I had become the embodiment of the village's misplaced faith, their desperate hope for miracles in a world full of suffering. But in the end, I had only proven that no man could carry such a burden alone. News of my fall spread beyond the village. The very same people who had once praised me now reviled me. I was no longer the miracle worker. I was the man who had dared to play God. The church in the neighboring town sent a new pastor to Aber, one who preached about humility and the dangers of false prophets. His sermons were laced with warnings about the perils of straying from God's true path, and though he never mentioned me by name, everyone knew I was the subject of his cautionary tales. I found myself retreating from public life, unable to face the constant reminders of my failure. I sought refuge in the old chapel on the outskirts of the village, a place no one visited anymore. There, I spent my days in solitude, reflecting on the choices I had made and the price I now had to pay. My body grew weak from the stress, and my spirit even weaker. The guilt was a weight I could not bear, and the voices of the villagers echoed in my mind, reminding me of the lives I had affected. Some of the women had moved on, trying to rebuild their lives, but others still carried the scars of my actions. Cece's sickly child was a constant reminder of the false hope I had given her, and her pain weighed heavily on my conscience. One afternoon, as I sat in the chapel, a young woman entered. Her face was unfamiliar, but the look in her eyes was all too recognizable: desperation. "I've heard about what you once did," she said, her voice trembling. "And I know you've been cast out, but I need your help. Please." Her plea shattered what little resolve I had left. Even after all that had happened, there were still those who believed in the legend of the Holy Manhood. But I could not help her. I had nothing left to give. The power that had once intoxicated me was gone, leaving only the hollow shell of a man who had fallen too far to rise again. In the end, the price of my actions was not just the loss of my position or the respect of the village. It was the loss of my soul. I had traded my integrity, my faith, and my marriage for fleeting fame and the illusion of power. The guilt weighed on me until I could no longer carry it. I had once thought I was chosen by God, but now I realized I had only been deceived by my own pride. Kojua never returned. The villagers moved on, but the memory of my scandal lingered like a shadow over Aber. The church reopened under new leadership, and the people began to heal from the wounds I had inflicted. But for me, there would be no healing. My body grew frail, and I became a ghost in the village that had once looked to me for guidance. One evening, as I lay in the small chapel where I had taken refuge, I felt a strange sense of peace. Perhaps this was my punishment, or perhaps it was simply the end of a long and painful journey. I had lived to see the consequences of my actions, and now I was ready to face whatever judgment awaited me. As I closed my eyes for the last time, I prayed not for forgiveness, but for understanding. I had paid the price for my actions, both in this life and, I feared, in the one to come. And as the darkness took me, I finally understood the full weight of my choices. The miracles had been a curse all along, and I had been blind to the truth until it was too late. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to the channel